The Buddhist tradition was established in significant part as a result of the first encounter by a young prince with the realities of aging, sickness, and death. The story of that encounter, which is well known to Buddhists around the world, is a fitting place to begin our exploration of death in Buddhism. The prince at the center of the story is Siddhartha Gautama, later known to the world as the Buddha. Born in what is now Nepal, near the northeast border with India, Siddhartha lived his first 29 years enjoying comfort and pleasure, thanks to an overprotective father who received a prophecy that his son would either grow up to be a king like himself or a religious teacher. By surrounding his son with nothing but beauty and leisure, the king assumed that Siddhartha would never want to leave the royal life. But eventually, Siddhartha made it outside the palace and saw three things that would change his life. First, he saw an old man, then encountered a man stricken by a severe illness. Finally, he came upon a corpse. Having never before encountered old age, illness, or death in his sheltered life, Siddhartha was shocked and disturbed by what he saw. The prince was most puzzled by the dead person, who, though dressed well, was utterly still and stiff and was followed by people in distress mourning him. Siddhartha asked, "Is this state of being peculiar to this man, or is such the end of all men?" And was told, "Death is certain for all." Deeply shaken, Siddhartha could never again return to the blissful ignorance and complacency of the palace. Siddhartha had also encountered wandering renunciates along his journey, mendicants who left the world behind to pursue liberation, and he became one of them. He committed himself to solving the ultimate existential problems of aging, sickness, and death, particularly the problem of samsara, the cycle of death and rebirth. Siddhartha decided to pursue not wealth or power, but liberation. His rejection of his life of luxury has become known as the Great Renunciation. We might ask, how is it possible that a person can live for 29 years and never know about aging, sickness, and death? Well, we do not need to take the story literally to understand its power. I would contend that young people know in an abstract, intellectual way that they will ultimately get old and that death is unavoidable. At the same time, most young people operate under a myth of immortality. As we've discussed, most people understand death in the abstract. Everybody dies. But that's quite different from truly understanding that I am going to die. This realization might not come until much later in life. For some people, death's existential reality hits us when we lose a loved one, deal with a serious illness, or have a near-death experience. We're then jolted out of our metaphorical sheltered palace, and with a shock of realization, understand how fleeting our time is. Some people try to bury this awareness, fleeing into distraction, but Siddhartha plunged directly into it. Before he left the palace, his father pleaded with him to stay. Siddhartha replied that he would give up his plan to become an ascetic if he had 4 guarantees: that my life would not be committed to death, that my health would not be overcome by disease, that my youth would not be marred by old age, and that prosperity would not be taken away by disaster. In other words, Siddhartha could only stay in the comfort of the palace if he knew that he would never have to experience suffering and loss. As life gives no such guarantees, in fact, it guarantees the opposite, Siddhartha left that very night. During his period of dedicated meditative and ascetic practice in the forest, Siddhartha learned a number of different techniques that he believed might provide liberation from suffering. These were techniques for absorption meditation, meditation in which senses and thoughts are shut down, and ultimately the activities of the body and mind cease entirely. In a sense, this does provide freedom from suffering. Attaining pure stillness doesn't allow for any agitation. But there are 2 problems with such states. First, they simply amount to insentience. How can one in such a state be said to really be alive? And second, they're temporary. Sooner or later, one emerges from such states and there's the world again, characterized by suffering and loss. This type of meditation provides only a short-term refuge. Siddhartha wanted to find a path to be free from suffering in the midst of life itself. And this is exactly what he found. The rest of this lecture will focus on what the Buddha discovered, particularly the teachings that are most relevant to the subject of death. Specific Buddhist death rituals vary greatly across the Buddhist world, and I'll discuss examples of those in the lectures on China and Tibet. Siddhartha's awakening, the title Buddha means awakened one, was a realization of the nature and cause of suffering and the way out. In his very first teaching, he put his discovery in terms that would become the most well-known formulation of Buddhist thought, the Four Noble Truths. The first of these truths is what we already know. Life, as we ordinarily live it, is characterized by suffering, anxiety, and dissatisfaction. The word that he used is dukkha, which is often translated as suffering. This is a problematic translation. When the Buddha said that life is dukkha, he did not mean that at each moment we're in obvious pain of some kind, and plenty of moments are pleasant and joyful. What he meant was that we are never fully content, that there's always some underlying dissatisfaction to life. Why? Because even when things are going well, we're aware, unconsciously, if not consciously, that things will change. Anything we have, any person we love, can be lost. Objects break. People leave us or die. Illness or accident is an ever-present possibility. We're haunted by the fact that our fortunes could change at any time. When a student of mine once objected to the Buddha's characterization of life as dukkha by saying, "But I'm perfectly happy now," I asked him if it's possible that he could receive a phone call with news that would rip the foundations out from under him and destroy his happiness. We all must admit that's true, that our moments of joy and pleasure are fragile and can be easily taken. Two of the characteristics of reality for Buddhists are impermanence and dukkha, and we can see why these are so closely intertwined. As nothing is permanent, there's nothing we can hold on to. We'll never be completely secure and content, and life will continue to be unsatisfactory. Sounds bad, but this is only the first noble truth. The second noble truth teaches that there's a cause to dukkha. It's not an inevitable feature of the world. And the cause is the mind's grasping and attachment. Since everything is impermanent, the quest for what is permanent is bound to fail and will itself be the source of suffering. So the key is not to try to find what's permanent. That'll never work. The key is to stop holding on, to loosen our grasp and let go. We must learn not to cling to things, to people, to ideas. This clinging is the source of greed, the lust for power, hatred, and anger. If we change the mind's habit of grasping, we are freed from these defilements. The third noble truth is the promise that this freedom is attainable. It's the assurance that the cessation of dukkha, the extinguishing of greed and anger, is possible. The experience of this is what is known as nirvana. The very term nirvana itself comes from a root meaning to extinguish or blow out. It refers to the elimination of all the defilements. And the fourth noble truth shows us the path to this freedom, called the Eightfold Path, a set of behaviors that will help to extinguish dukkha. The Eightfold Path can be divided into three categories: right thought, so understanding what the Buddha taught, right ethics and conduct, and right meditation, which means cultivating the mind to overcome negative mental habits. If Buddhist practice means cultivating the art of letting go, then it seems the ideal preparation for dying. In addition to dukkha and impermanence, Buddhists describe a third characteristic of reality, anatman, or no self. In an earlier lecture, we saw how Hindus solve the problem of impermanence and suffering. Find that which is permanent and enduring, that which is outside of all change and thus cannot suffer. And they discovered this in the Atman, the soul, which is reborn into a new body and life after life until liberation. In Hinduism, Once one realizes one's true identity as Atman, which is itself divine, one is freed from identification with the impermanent, suffering body and mind. The Buddha rejected this solution. He taught that meditation reveals something else. Unlike absorption meditation, which shuts out the world, the Buddha developed what we call mindfulness meditation, a way of looking deeply and clearly at the world rather than shutting it out. This leads to insight about the nature of reality by allowing the meditator to observe calmly, without judgment, all phenomena that arise, both within one's mind, so thoughts and emotions and memories, and in the outside world, all of the sensations that bombard us daily. One learns to observe these phenomena without getting attached to them. They arise and then pass, so one directly experiences the truth of impermanence. And here's where we get to the truth of no self. The Buddha taught that when we look deeply, we find that no stable, unchanging self exists. We construct a notion of our self in our mind, but that's all it is, a construction. We create an I separate from the world, a subject over and against a world of objects. The Buddhist challenge is this: if you claim that there's something unchanging about you, a permanent self or soul, then where is it? How do we find it? I mean, think about it. What about you doesn't change over time? Your body is radically different from what it was when you were a child. In fact, in subtle and sometimes not so subtle ways, your body's changing constantly, even at the cellular level. Our minds are even more volatile, with our thoughts and emotions changing rapidly throughout the day. There's nothing that doesn't change, and nothing about us is completely separate from the world. Every time I breathe or eat, the border between me and the world is exposed as permeable. So rather than a stable, enduring separate self, we are a dynamic series of processes in an ongoing, interdependent relationship with the world. Here's one important element of the Buddhist perspective on death. If we don't have a separate self to begin with, what does death really take from us? If we can see past the illusion of an enduring, unchanging self, thus freeing ourselves from clinging to ourselves, we will be able to accept dying as one more series of changes. Might it be possible that in a deep sense, as we look at death, we discover that we have nothing, no thing to lose? The concepts of dukkha, impermanence, and no self, along with the notion of liberation and the meditative path to realizing it, are the keys to understanding the Buddhist approach to death. But before we look at the Buddhist recommendation on how to face death, let's recall the concept of samsara, the cycle of death and rebirth. Like Hindus, Buddhists believe in samsara, and that samsara is driven by karma. My intentions and actions plant seeds that will in some way come to fruition and affect me, either in this life or in future lives. Buddhists generally believe that there are 6 possible realms of rebirth. One of these is the human realm. Just below us is the realm of the animals, whose lives are largely concerned with survival. Below them is the realm of the hungry ghosts, who are portrayed with large bellies but tiny mouths and throats, ensuring that they'll be perpetually unsatisfied. At the lowest level are the hell realms, where those who have done the most evil are tormented. Above the human realm are 2 other realms. The lower of these is the realm of beings called asharas, sometimes conceived of as demigods or titans, deities who contend with each other and struggle with envy and desire for power, somewhat like the Greek gods. Because they're more powerful than humans and are said to have more pleasurable lives, they're considered higher, but their lives are certainly not peaceful. At the highest realm are the devas, the contented deities who live blissfully. It's important to keep in mind that all these realms are temporary. Beings are there only until the karma that put them there is burned off, at which point they'll move to a new destination. While some Buddhists might aspire to a better rebirth on the wheel of life, a wealthier, more comfortable human being, a contented deva, The ultimate goal is to get off of the cycle altogether and attain nirvana. While some Buddhists see these realms as actual places, others see them in a more psychological and metaphorical way. In the course of a single day, we can move from a heavenly realm as we eat a delicious meal or get some great news, to a hellish realm as some tragedy befalls us. We can be endlessly dissatisfied hungry ghosts or competitive power-hungry titans. In other words, rebirth can be seen as going on all the time. As one Buddhist master said, every single moment we're undergoing birth and death. One question that Buddhists who believe in these realms of rebirth as actual locations have to answer is this. If there's no self, then what gets reborn in life after life? There are different approaches to answering this question, but here's one common metaphor. If I have a lit candle, and then I use its flame to light another candle, and then the first flame is extinguished, is the second flame the same as or different than the first? The answer seems to be neither. They're not identical, not completely different. Such it is with human beings. We are not exactly the same person from life to life, in the same way that we're not exactly the same from childhood to adulthood, or year to year, or day to day. So one way to think of our lives is as continuity without identity. In the candle example, the energy of the first flame gave rise to the existence of the second, so the two are linked through time in a chain of causality. And this is the case with us too. There's a chain of continuity, a karmic chain of causes and conditions that leads from the infant me to the adolescent me to the current me. And so when I die, the karmic inheritance from my life gives rise to a new being. But through it all, there is no unchanging, enduring element. The Buddha gave a detailed account of mindfulness meditation. The basic approach is to sit in a stable posture. Many monks sit in the lotus posture or some variation, and observe the movement of your breath as it comes into and out of your body. As you try to keep your attention on the breath, the flood of thoughts, memories of the past, plans and anxieties about the future will demand and often carry off your attention. With a great deal of practice, however, you'll learn to observe all of these things without clinging to them and return your attention to the breath. In the Satipatthana Sutra, the Foundations of Mindfulness, the Buddha has a group of monks, bhikkhus in the Pali language of the earliest recorded sutras, direct awareness at a decomposing corpse. Now, it would be difficult to do this in many Western countries today. In America, for instance, we quickly move a corpse into the care of professionals. It's either hidden from view and either rapidly buried or artificially preserved from decay. But this was not the case in the ancient world, and is still not the case in many parts of India today. The Buddha taught that there were important lessons in the close observation of a decaying corpse. He said, "Bhikkhus, just as a bhikkhu sees a body dead 1, 2, or 3 days, swollen, blue, and festering, thrown onto the cemetery, so he applies this perception to his own body thus. Verily, my own body too is of the same nature. Such it will become, and will not escape it." This not only includes an unflinching description of the physical reality of decomposition, it also reminds us not to see this corpse as an other, but as one's own inevitable future state. One must identify oneself with that corpse, and ultimately with a skeleton. We've seen how skeletons play an important role in art all over the world as a reminder of mortality. Well, here, monks make use of actual skeletons. Bones can be found in some monasteries for this very reason. As an interesting side note, Buddhist monks who live in America don't have many opportunities to meditate on a decomposing corpse. In the 1980s, the abbot of an American Zen center was jogging through a park, veered off the usual path, and came upon a recently dead body, a person who was believed to be a suicide victim. Rather than report this to the police, which is what virtually all of us would do, the monk thought, what a perfect opportunity to do the meditation on the corpse. He returned daily to meditate there until the body was discovered and taken away. Why does mindfulness meditation work? Well, first, it shows us that most, if not all, of our suffering is self-inflicted. The regrets over past mistakes, the fears about the future, the anger and frustration over our failures, and so many other painful aspects of our lives are produced by the mind. If the mind can be transformed, the suffering will end. When we pay attention to our minds, we find that they spend a surprising percentage of the time somewhere other than where our bodies are. Our bodies and breath are always here, in the present, but our minds spend large amounts of time revisiting the past, speculating about the future, or visiting fantasy realms that we create. And some of this can be quite important and fruitful, but much of the time it's the source of a great amount of unnecessary, destructive suffering. The anger produced by revisiting a past argument, the anxiety about a future situation that may or may not occur, the fantasy of fulfilling our greedy desire or getting revenge on someone, all bring about suffering, our own and often others, through the operations of our own mind. Bringing the mind back to the present moment, the experience of the body and breath, being able to observe these movements of the mind from the stable platform of centered awareness, diminishes the power of the negative thoughts and emotions. We identify less and less with these destructive patterns of the mind as we identify more and more with the calm, spacious awareness that observes them. We see the truth of impermanence and dukkha for ourselves, providing insight into the nature of reality. We also cultivate the ability to stop clinging and to accept the reality of our situation. While we can aim to make things better, of course, we must start from a recognition of reality and acceptance of the way things are. Some things cannot be avoided. Foremost among them is death. We can now see how Buddhist mindfulness practice can be brought to the experience of dying. Here, I'll focus on the Buddhist perspective on one's own dying experience, but this can also be applied to the process of grieving the death of a loved one. When some people are asked how they want to die, they answer, "In my sleep." While this is certainly preferable to a painful, difficult death, it is not the ideal from the Buddhist perspective. The ideal would be to die consciously, with full awareness. For one thing, Buddhists focus on the impermanence of all phenomena, and death is the most powerful teacher of impermanence. This is why the Buddhist tradition reminds us regularly, with a variety of death meditations, that we're going to die. One chant, entitled 5 Subjects for Frequent Recollection, contains the words, "I am of the nature to die. I have not gone beyond dying. All that is mine, beloved and pleasing, will become otherwise, will become separated from me." This is why dying in our sleep is not ideal. We should not miss out on the literally ultimate experience of dying. We should observe the moment-to-moment process of our own dying, applying the spacious awareness of mindfulness to each sensation as it arises. This is where mindfulness training is very useful at the time of death, as the experience of dying can be extremely distressing, filled with mind-produced fear, regret, and anger. The aim at the time of death is this: don't think about some possible afterlife. Don't worry about what will happen to others after you die. Don't go back over how you've lived your life. Just directly attend to the dying process. In the tradition of Soto Zen Buddhism, which developed in Japan in the 12th century, there was an emphasis on bringing full awareness to the simple present moment. This can be an important reminder in a world of unapologetically nonstop multitaskers. Mindfulness practice can be an antidote to distraction and missing out on large parts of our own lives. The word just becomes quite important. When eating, just eat. When walking, just walk. And when dying, just die. This is very different from the idea of conquering death we so often encounter. In fact, as the Thai meditation master Ajahn Chah noted, Even the Buddha himself, with his great store of accumulated virtue, could not avoid physical death. When counseling the dying, Ajahn Chah reminds us that the Buddha taught, quote, that this is the nature of the body. It can't be any other way. Having been born, it gets old and sick, and then it dies. This is a great truth that you are presently encountering. Look at the body with this wisdom and realize it. Some people might find it natural for a dying person to find comfort or meaning in revisiting the past, surveying one's life and accomplishments, or focusing on one's relationships. But Ajahn Chah advises, quote, don't think a lot. Just think, this is the way things are. Right now, nobody can help you. There's nothing that your family and your possessions can do for you. All that can help you now is the correct awareness. So don't waver. Let go. Throw it all away. He guides a dying woman with an unadorned directness. He says, you've been alive a long time. Your eyes have seen any number of forms and colors. You've had any number of experiences. And that's all they were, just experiences. Don't go grasping at thoughts of your children or relatives. Don't grasp at anything whatsoever. Don't worry about your family. At the moment, they are as they are. In the future, they will be like you. Let go. Let the breath be its sole object of knowledge. All that remains is the feeling of wakefulness. This is called meeting the Buddha. Neither the past nor loved ones can be our refuges. We find refuge in the non-clinging mind, the mind of equanimity and acceptance. Ajahn Chah is teaching a way to die without suffering. He points out that the primary problem isn't the discomfort of the body, but the agitation of the mind. So the Buddhist approach to death centers on the transformation of the mind. One who dies with a peaceful mind will have a peaceful death. The notion of conscious dying, dying with full awareness and acceptance, is a growing practice in America. In fact, there's a Conscious Dying Institute and a Dying Consciously teacher training. The latter features a statement, our goal is to leave this life alive, to die consciously. Author and poet Stephen Levine, who has worked with the sick and dying for many years, presents the Buddhist perspective on death in an accessible way in his book, Who Dies? An investigation of conscious living and conscious dying. He writes about the way that an encounter with death heightens our awareness profoundly. He states, one of the remarkable things about confronting death is the depth at which it gets our attention. If you could fully experience even a moment of being in its totality, you would discover what you have always been looking for. We don't pay attention to most things, but death catches our eye. Focusing on death is a way of becoming fully alive. He reminds us that our task in the dying process is the same as it has been all along, to be fully aware in a non-clinging way to each moment as it arises. He writes, to let go of the last moment and open to the next is to die consciously moment to moment. The great Japanese poet Basho said, from olden times it has been customary to leave behind a death poem, and perhaps I should do the same. But every moment of life is the last. Every poem, a death poem. So whether we're talking about the unfolding of our lives or the experience of our deaths, Levine's advice is the same. Become one with the process. Buddhist masters serve as examples of how one dies in awareness by making their deaths a teaching. One story is told about the death of Zen master Roshi Taji. One of his senior disciples remembered that the master was fond of a certain kind of cake and desperately searched for hours through the pastry shops of Tokyo to find it. Returning, he offered the cake to Taji, who smiled and accepted it. But even as he began to munch, he grew visibly weaker, and his disciples leaned over him to ask him if he had any final words for them. Yes, whispered the master, and they eagerly leaned close to hear his final words of wisdom. "Please tell us," they said. "My, but this cake is delicious," said Roshitaji. And with that, he died. Even in the face of imminent death, he lived each moment fully. And his last words, rather than being an attempt to utter some profundity, were an expression of his being completely present to the experience of tasting. The ephemeral nature of life, when completely embraced, heightens our experience. What about the Buddha's own death? As he neared the end, he gave advice to his disciples, telling them not to rely on anyone for the truth but themselves. Waking up to the way things are must be done by each person. The practice is one of direct experience, not relying on others. The Buddha said, "You must be your own lamps, be your own refuges. Take refuge in nothing outside yourselves." A monk becomes his own lamp and refuge by continually looking on his body, feelings, perceptions, moods, and ideas in such a manner that he conquers the cravings and depressions of ordinary men. The very last words of the Buddha are a reminder of impermanence and encouragement to continue one's practice in the face of it. All composite things must pass away. Strive onward vigilantly.